What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Good morning. The first item of business is general questions, and at question number 1 I call Fulton MacGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on whether the Domestic Abuse Scotland Act 2018 has assisted the police in responding to reports of coercive control and stalking behaviours from members of the public.
Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance.
Presiding Officer, research on the operation of our groundbreaking legislation found that it better reflects how adult victims experience domestic abuse. Police Scotland are committed to supporting effective and consistent implementation. Staff and officers have had training and support to ensure they fully understand the legislation and how to best use it to protect victims and bring offenders to justice. Recent reports have highlighted that more is needed to make it easier for people to report domestic abuse and for perpetrators to be appropriately dealt with. And I am committed to working with partners across justice to consider how we best address this.
Fulton MacGregor.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that very positive response. In recent months, I've had contact from a constituent who reports continuing harassment from an ex-partner through the use of ring doorbells, although not on her property. She further reports that the police dealing with her case seem unsure how to take forward such complaints regarding ring doorbells, though are extremely sympathetic to the overall situation. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise if the current legislation on coercive control could include such behaviours that include the use of ring doorbells, and if so, what further training may be necessary for frontline workers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, domestic CCTV, such as video doorbells, is covered by data protection legislation, which of course is a matter reserved to the UK Government and nonetheless is regulated by the Information Commissioner's Office. If an individual believes that domestic CCTV is being used in a way that is antisocial, harassing or intimidating, that this may be a criminal matter and they can of course contact the police. There is of course more work to be done, which I am committed to exploring in and around the use of data, but there is a very clear message that despite the strategic shift in policing to prioritise and understand and to tackle domestic abuse with lots of examples of good practice, we know from all the most recent research that improvements could be made across the justice sector on how cases are handled, and we need to be given victims maximum assurance that their voice is heard and that proceedings and support throughout the process is more available.
Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Parties across this chamber agreed with the 2018 Act. However, for the Act to be truly effective, the police need more resources. As it stands, frontline officers don't have the support they need from the government to fully enforce the new law. So, given the rise in domestic abuse cases since the Act was brought in, does the Cabinet Secretary accept that the police need more resources to deal with more domestic abuse crimes?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, in terms of the most recent domestic abuse crime stats, while there has actually been a decrease of 1% from the previous years, I would of course agree with the member that these figures are a stark reminder about the gendered and hidden nature of domestic abuse, and that we need to be committed to tackle the systemic issue in our society, both today, tomorrow and for the long run. In terms of issues about resources for police, the policing investment is £1.45 billion for this financial year. That is an additional £80 million, an increase of 6.3%, and right across the justice sector we are investing £3.4 billion, again an increase of £165 million, and that investment is being put to good use to deliver justice for women.
Question number 2, Michael Marra.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it plans to review its approach to drafting financial memoranda in light of concerns raised by the Finance and Public Administration Committee.
Cabinet Secretary Shona Robertson.
The Scottish Government endeavours to provide its best estimates of anticipated costs and/or savings in the financial memoranda which accompany bills in line with the requirements of standing orders. The Scottish Government is also committed to responding to any issues identified by Parliament in its scrutiny of bills and their accompanying documents.
Michael Marra.
Last week, the Deputy First Minister admitted that her government had managed the public's money so poorly there's a looming £1.9 billion black hole in the public finances. Is that any wonder when their approach to drafting financial memoranda is so woefully inadequate? The committee in question has raised serious concerns about the financial memoranda for two significant pieces of legislation, the National Care Service Bill and the Children, Care and Justice Bill. Can I ask the Government ask the Minister why the Government doesn't think it necessary to publish a revised financial memorandum for either bill before the conclusion of stage 1?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, on Michael Marra's comments on the MTFS statement last week, of course, if he'd been listening to what I said in the statement, he would have heard, and this is of course confirmed by the Fiscal Commission, that the key reasons for the challenge in next year's budget in particular are firstly due to UK Government cuts to both resource and capital budgets to this Parliament, and Michael Marra should know, of course, that makes up the bulk of the money that this Parliament and this Government has to spend. Secondly, of course, inflation and the impact that that has on our budget, and of course the impact that has on the pay deals that go beyond what was budgeted for in last year's budget. So Michael Marra should stick to the facts about what is lying behind the statement I had to make last week. In terms of the issues on the financial memoranda, in terms of the Children's Care and Justice Bill response, we of course welcome the feedback of the Finance Committee and the views coming forward at stage 1. The issue is really that the matters have developed in terms of the financial memorandum. Inflation has increased, and of course the Scottish Government could not have forecast, which of course the committee itself acknowledges that the Government could not have forecast the inflation increase. So the stage 1 process has brought additional detail and helpful information, and that is of course part of the bill process. There will be an update to the financial memorandum based on stage 1 and based on the updated information from partners that are involved in the implementation group, and that work will take place and will update the financial memorandum following and reflecting stage 1. And on the National Care Service, the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport has agreed to provide an updated financial memorandum as well as a response to the recommendations of the report 4 weeks before the stage 1 debate, and of course that will take account of any agreements and decisions reached over the summer.
Question number 3, Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it plans to publish the review by Zero Waste Scotland into the environmental impact of single-use vapes.
Minister Lorna Slater.
The Scottish Government recognises the significant concerns around the environmental impacts of single-use vapes, alongside the prevalence of young people vaping in Scottish society. On the environmental impacts, Zero Waste Scotland submitted the initial findings of their report on the impact of single-use vapes at the end of May. The findings are currently being considered, and the report is undergoing final revisions prior to publication, which we expect to take place in June. I look forward to the report's findings being published and the opportunity to discuss potential next steps to address this issue.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank the Minister for that reply. And as the Minister will be aware, the BBC recently reported where they took 18 vape products found in a school in England, almost all of which were not legally registered or tested, and sent them for independent testing, which showed they contained highly toxic chemicals such as crotonaldehyde in concentrations well above the recognised safe exposure levels, in addition to containing heavy metals such as lead, chromium and cadmium. I can ask the Minister what work is being done across Government to tackle the damage that these devices are doing, not only to the environment, but also to our young people's health.
Minister.
I am deeply concerned about recent reports of illicit vapes containing high levels of lead, nickel and chromium. UK-wide regulations are in place to ensure minimum standards for the safety and quality of e-cigarettes. Through the Society of Chief Officers of Trading Standards in Scotland, we continue to support strong national and local alliances to tackle the availability and sale to under-18s of illicit tobacco and vapes. Any action we seek to take will build on the regulations already in place to restrict the marketing, promotion and sale of vaping products to under-18s.
Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I received representations from a young person in Shetland with concerns about the impacts on health, the environment and peer pressure from vaping. Flavours such as bubblegum and candy floss and bright rainbow packaging on shop counters are not there to catch the eye of adults. I spoke with my constituent this morning. They want to see the sale of vapes removed from shop counters. Will the Scottish Government review regulations on vape sales, packaging and advertising?
Minister.
The report from Zero Waste Scotland will look at a range of available policy options, including a potential ban on single-use vapes. I am fully aware of the strength of feeling on this matter, and particularly concerns around young people's use of vapes. There have been powerful campaigns for a ban undertaken by Less Waste Laura and the Daily Record and others. So this review will consider various options, for example, increasing access to responsible disposal options and improved product design. So I look forward to that review coming out, and we'll discuss next steps from there.
Question number 4, Craig Hoy. Thank you. Mr Hoy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Apologies about that. To ask the Scottish Government what additional support it plans to provide to tourism, hospitality and leisure operators in the South of Scotland region.
Minister Richard Lockhead.
The Scottish Government recognises that the tourism, hospitality and leisure sectors are a crucially important part of the South of Scotland economy, and these sectors create jobs, sustain communities and contribute significantly to the well-being of the southern Scotland economy, and often forming the cornerstone of the local economy as well, and enabling visitors and residents alike to experience the incredible offers we have across the whole region. And we are supporting the South of Scotland Destination Alliance with a £2.7 million 5-year funding package. That's an industry-led leadership group driving the region's tourism, marketing and destination development. We are also working with a diverse range of businesses throughout the region, from large projects such as a £2.6 million investment in the £18 million sustainable development in the Tweed Valley and Forest holiday cabins at Glen Tress Forest. And we're also working with different accommodation and attractions in the region, from glamping to museums and visitor facilities.
Craig Hoy.
I thank the Minister for that answer, but all that he said overlooks the fact that he is well aware that many operators face far higher business rates as a result of his government's failure to pass on 75% rates relief that is being made available in England. Pubs and cafes also face enormous pressures, including the shambolic deposit return scheme, while tourism operators face the burden of the SNP's short-term lets regulations. So isn't it the case that the SNP not only lacks a dedicated Minister for Tourism, it also lacks any credible policy to support this vitally important sector in the south of Scotland?
Minister.
As the Minister with responsibility for tourism and hospitality, can I just say how much I enjoyed my recent visit to Glen Tress to meet the company that are investing millions of pounds into that region, and it's great to see that the product that's being developed in his region is attracting so much investment and will attract visitors from around the world to visit. Can I also say that whilst we do recognise there's a role for the Scottish Government to play in a subgroup of the new business deal, we'll look at business rates and other issues. The issues I find that tourism businesses in the south of Scotland and elsewhere raise with me are high energy costs, the need to cut VAT, the impact of high inflation, the impact of Brexit on labour shortages, all of which are the responsibility of the Members' Party in the UK Government, the Conservative Party. So likewise, he may wish to make strong representations to them.
Emma Harper.
The Minister mentioned energy costs and the impact of the energy crisis on hospitality, on pubs and bars and restaurants, including across the South Scotland, has been substantial, with trade bodies recently revealing an average of bills that have surged by 81% over the past year. Can the Minister provide any update regarding the Scottish Government's latest engagement with the UK Government regarding the support that can be provided to businesses experiencing the pressures with energy costs? And does he anticipate that further support will be forthcoming?
We must have brief questions and responses, Minister.
Well, thanks, and we certainly share the industry's concerns that Emma Harper raises about the impact of rising overheads, such as energy costs. We have extended energy advice to businesses by investing £300,000 to expand the services of Business Energy Scotland, whilst also doubling the value of the SME Energy Efficiency Loan and Cashback Scheme for energy efficiency to £20,000. We've also established a task force with COSLA to support businesses, because we know there's much more that needs to be done. But the Minister for Energy, in terms of rising energy costs, is due to meet the UK Minister for Energy Consumers next week, and will be raising this very important issue with her at that time, and will continue to make strong representations to the UK Government to address high energy costs.
Question number 5, Graham Simpson.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what options it foresees for the future of Ferguson Marine after ferries 801 and 802 are built.
Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We know that Ferguson Marine is actively pursuing many streams of future work, such as the recently announced contract with BAE to support the Type 26 frigate programme, and we are committed to securing a sustainable future for the shipyard.
Graham Simpson.
Well, I would thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, but it wasn't an answer because it didn't answer the question, which was what options he sees for the future. I don't know what options he foresees for the future, but if he wants to return the yard to the private sector, as he says he does, then investment's going to be needed. So has he done an assessment of how much investment? The Scottish Government has commissioned an independent review into funding and future options for the yard. When are we going to see that?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I thank Graham Simpson for his question. Ferguson Marine has provided the Scottish Government with a formal request for capital investment as part of its plan to make the shipyard more competitive, and this request is currently being evaluated. Any request for funding will of course be subject to subsidy control impacts and other assessments that are required, and Parliament would of course be updated in due course. But I'm sure in terms of asking about the publication of the document that he refers to, I'm sure Graham Simpson would not want to make the yard uncompetitive by releasing commercially sensitive information that is contained within it. Of course, we're looking at the detail that we can publish, and that work is ongoing.
Katie Clark.
Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that it's the Scottish Government's responsibility to clear up this mess? It's not the fault of the excellent workforce at Ferguson Marine, or indeed the people of Inverclyde? And will he provide a timescale on potential future ferry contracts after 801 and 802?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Of course I pay tribute to the workforce who have been, as I've done in all the times that I have either appeared before committee or in this chamber, for the outstanding work that they are doing in incredibly difficult circumstances. We have taken decisions about ensuring that 801 and 802 can continue to be progressed and completed at the yard, and will continue to support the yard to secure future work as best we can going forward.
Question number 6, Paul O'Kane.
to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on Phase 3 of the Learning Estate Investment Programme, including in relation to the planned date for the announcement of successful projects.
Cabinet Secretary Jenny Gilruth.
Presiding Officer, I know that local authorities are keen to get clarity on Phase 3 of the Learning Estate Investment Programme. I recently visited Perth High School and the Dunfermline Learning Campus projects, and I very much recognise the difference sleep projects will make to local areas. Scottish Government officials wrote to all local authorities in March to explain that consideration about the projects that would form part of Phase 3 was still ongoing. This set out that further time was necessary to consider the scope of Phase 3, including to take account of the impact of market volatility on current projects. However, I am committed to announcing the successful Phase 3 projects before the end of this parliamentary session.
Paul Kane.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. It's clear that Parliament needs to see details of this now overdue Phase 3 of the Learning Estate Investment Programme, because currently there are too many schools across Scotland which are in desperate need of upgrading. As the Cabinet Secretary will be aware, in my region it's been estimated that it could cost up to £160 million to rectify Renfrewshire Council's monumental error in the calculation of the school roll for the new Dargaville Primary School in Bishopton. Indeed, the First Minister, in answer to my colleague Neil Bibby, said that the Cabinet Secretary would enter discussions with Renfrewshire Council to try and resolve this situation, and indeed to try and avoid any detriment to the learning resource available to Renfrewshire Council. So can she confirm if these discussions have taken place, and can she assure the Chamber that there will be no detriment to the Learning Estate Investment Fund allocations to Renfrewshire in order to resolve the error, given the need for new schools across the authority?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr O'Kane for his question. He may not be aware that this issue was raised by his colleague in the Chamber yesterday during the debate that we held on the national discussion. I committed to Neil Bibby yesterday to meet with him and to meet with the parents as well involved in the school that he has outlined. I know that officials are already engaging with the local authority, and I intend to do so imminently. In relation to the investment coming from this government, I would just like to put on the record, Presiding Officer, that since, of course, the SNP came to power, we have significantly invested in our school estate. When the SNP first came to power back in 2007, only 61% of our schools were in good or satisfactory condition. Today, that's over 90%. Now, that's real progress under this government. There's more undoubtedly that we will need to do, and I look forward to working with the member to that end to drive the improvements we need to see across our school estate.
That concludes general questions. The next item of business is First Minister's questions. At question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, a low emission zone came into force in Glasgow. It will prevent many vehicles from entering the city centre, and if a driver breaks the rules, they could face hefty fines into hundreds of pounds. So can the First Minister tell us how many vehicles applied for an exemption to this scheme but were refused?
First Minister.
First of all, this is of course a scheme run by Glasgow City Council. It's a scheme that I am very supportive of, and of course I think all of the Parliament should be supportive of the low emission zones. Why? Because we know of course that air pollution is a serious problem, particularly in our city conurbations, particularly in Glasgow, and that's why of course the introduction of the LEZ has been welcomed by the likes of Asthma and Lung UK, as well as many other third sector organisations with an interest in public health. I don't have the exact figure to hand that Douglas Ross has asked for, but I do know, of course, that there has been an LEZ exemptions process that has been put in place, and of course a number of time-limited exemptions have been granted. But what I would say to Douglas Ross is I do hope that in his questioning he will be unequivocal in his support for LEZs, because of course every single week, rightly so, members of this Parliament question this government on what more we can do to tackle the climate emergency. In the Conservatives' case, every time we bring forward a measure, or indeed our local authorities bring forward a measure, they seem to oppose it time and time and time again. So it is absolutely critical for all of us that believe in tackling this climate emergency as a priority, that we don't just talk the talk, but we're prepared to walk the walk.
Douglas Ross.
Well, I really hope the First Minister would start answering questions rather than telling opposition leaders what they should be asking, because, as usual with the SNP, the problem with this policy is the delivery. There have been numerous warnings about the implementation from people and organisations across Scotland. SNP members are saying this is an exaggeration. So let's just look at one of the many charities raising concerns. Joe Fitzpatrick, a government minister, wants to shout me down while I am speaking about a charity in Glasgow raising concerns. So maybe Joe Fitzpatrick, the First Minister and the SNP could listen to Homeless Project Scotland. They were refused an exemption, and still they heckle. Homeless Project Scotland refused an exemption to use a refrigerated van within the restricted area. Their chairman, Colin McInnes, said it helps to feed 300 people every day. It collects food from 15 to 20 businesses in the city centre, right at the heart of the low emission zone. His message was simple. Exemptions for exceptional circumstances must be reviewed. Mr McInnes continued, if 300 people queuing for many hours for food on the streets of Glasgow is not exceptional, then they need to publish what is exceptional. Does Hamza Youssef agree this outstanding charity deserves an exemption from this scheme?
First Minister. I do commend the work that's done by the Homeless Project in Glasgow. We do have to ask ourselves, of course, why are they having to feed so many people in any given week? And that's undoubtedly the case because of over a decade of Tory austerity, because of a cost of living crisis, because of high inflation, because of high energy costs. That is why, of course, they're having to do the work that they're having to do. I would urge Glasgow, as they have already done in my understanding, to engage with the third sector, with charities, including, of course, the Homeless Project. Glasgow have been very transparent. The application process for time-limited exemptions in Glasgow is published on the Glasgow City Council website. There has been, of course, a lead-in time in relation to the LEZ being introduced. So we know, of course, that there is an exemption process, but clearly it is imperative on all of us, whether it's the public who are in Glasgow, whether it's charities, whether it's the third sector, and all of us, to have to make sure we are doing everything possible in our gift to tackle the serious problems around air pollution. I go back to what I said in my first answer, Presiding Officer. Time and time again, Douglas Ross will stand up and demand we do more to tackle the climate emergency. But whether it's on DRS, whether it's on the workplace parking levy, whether, of course, it's on LEZ, he will oppose. And why will he oppose? Not because, of course, anything to do with any principled stance in relation to the climate emergency. He opposes it simply because the SNP proposes it, and that is not good enough.
Douglas Ross. I oppose it when the SNP make a shambolic mess of every one of these schemes that they bring in. And the First Minister wants to commend Homeless Project Scotland, but refuses to stand up and say their one van that helps to feed 300 people every day should get an exemption. That is not commending a charity. That is condemning them and their inability now to do the work they want to do. The delivery of this scheme has been tone deaf to the needs of the city and charities like Homeless Project Scotland. Now, SNP members wanted to heckle me when I spoke about charities. Will they do the same when I now read out quotes from businesses? Because they've also been raising now it's Cabinet Secretaries don't want to hear what businesses in Glasgow think. I know Jenny Goruth used to be the Transport Minister, but she should be listening to these points just now.
Mr Ross,
because
please
businesses
continue.
are saying this to politicians across the political spectrum, and SNP members think it's funny. So let's listen. Stephen Grant. It is funny when the Health Secretary is laughing at this. So Stephen Grant of Unite Glasgow Taxi Drivers has said, this is Steve Grant, Unite Glasgow Taxi Drivers said this. This damaging and punitive plan is going to be devastating for our trade without a shadow of a doubt. Local business owner William Payton, who runs a garage within the restricted zone, says, it just feels like it's been poorly thought out and we've been left in a horrible position because of it. Stuart Patrick, Chief Executive Officer of Glasgow Chambers of Commerce, said, while we are supportive of the aims of the LEZ, the Chamber does not support using it as a political measure to drive all private cars away from the city centre. And this morning, Donald MacLeod of the Nighttime Industries Association said, actually, what we've got here is going to be a low economy zone getting created. He's right, isn't he? And what does Hamza Youssef have to say to all these businesses and all their workers who are concerned that this scheme is going to put jobs at risk?
First Minister.
First and foremost, I go back to the point that there has, of course, been a considerable lead-in time for the Glasgow LEZ coming into place, and there has been extensive engagement Oh, it's fine for Douglas Ross to dish it out now, but he can't take it when he's standing up with his question. Let me of course give Douglas Ross some of the facts around the LEZ in Glasgow. Not only has it had a lengthy and extensive lead-in time, there has of course been considerable engagement with businesses, with the community, with the third sector, with charities as well. And in terms of support as well, to support low-income households and small businesses get prepared, the LEZ Support Fund did offer financial support towards the disposal of non-LEZ compliant vehicles. In 2020-2021, the LEZ Support Fund awarded £1.7 million in grants, £3.85 million in 21-22. £5 million was awarded through the LEZ Support Fund in 22-23, and that fund, while it is now closed, of course, however, those eligible were encouraged, of course, to register their interest, and as a result of that fund, the LEZ Support Fund, it resulted in over 2,500 non-LEZ compliant vehicles being disposed or retrofitted with cleaner technology. So there has been funding there, not just for, as I say, low-income households, but in particular for small businesses as well. So when it comes to tackling the climate emergency, something all of us in this chamber claim to have an interest in, claim to say that is a priority, really is easy. The warm words are easy. The rhetoric is easy. Taking action is the hard bit. And this government will never shy away, nor should our local authorities, from taking the tough action that is required in order to tackle the biggest threat our planet faces.
Douglas Ross. The only thing that answer proved is it took till question 3 for Hamza Youssef to find his pre-prepared script in his folder on this issue. But this LEZ is the latest anti-driver policy from the SNP.
Thank you.
That looks like being an absolute shambles in the making. So they've cut investment in roads, they're not tackling Scotland's pothole problems, they're not supporting car drivers, they have proposed a car park tax, and they are increasing the cost of driving across Scotland. Now, approximately 750,000 vehicles in Scotland will be fined if they drive through this zone in Glasgow. The LEZ is hurting charities' ability to function. It's risking jobs, and business leaders think it's going to create a low-economy zone. Wouldn't it have been better, First Minister, to delay this scheme for a year and properly listen to the concerns of businesses, charities, individuals and organisations who have been raising these concerns, have been hoping for a change, but have been left with no answers, no response, and a tone-deaf government who refused to listen to them?
First Minister.
And in the meantime, of course, if we had delayed, more people would have suffered in terms of their asthma, more people would have suffered because of their lung conditions, more people would have suffered because of CPD. More of the citizens of Glasgow would have suffered dire health consequences because we know air pollution in Glasgow is nowhere near the standards that we want it to be, and the LEZ, of course, will help with that. It is an undeniable fact, Presiding Officer, that every time this SNP government brings forward action to tackle the biggest threat our planet faces, that Douglas Ross and the Conservatives oppose time and time and time again. They oppose the workplace parking levy. They oppose, of course, the DRS scheme, even though they had it in their manifesto, that they stood on. Douglas Ross, of course, stood on the manifesto for a deposit return scheme, but now opposes it. And when we look to invest and unleash the potential of the green economy in the North East, what do we get from the UK government, from the Tory UK government? Complete and utter inaction. Not a single penny of funding towards the Scottish cluster or the ACARE or the ACORN project. Not a single penny to support the economy, the green economy.
Members, First Minister, I think we are not going to continue in this vein. We are representatives of the people of Scotland. We are sitting in the National Parliament. I'd be very grateful if all who are tuning in could hear answers and questions. Thank you.
They don't want to hear about the fact that they have been utterly missing from taking any action to tackle the climate emergency here in Scotland. Let me end by saying this to the Conservatives. When it comes to tackling
the climate emergency, whether it's LEZs, whether it's DRS. The real potential for Scotland, of course, both from tackling the climate emergency and from an economic point of view, is unleashing the green potential of the North East and of Scotland. For a party that has plundered and taken £300 billion of revenue from the North East, the very least they could do is match our £500 million Just Transition Fund and help us to tackle the climate emergency that is affecting our globe. It's the biggest priority, the biggest threat this country and indeed the world faces.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the First Minister tell us how many Scots died last year while languishing on an NHS waiting list?
First Minister.
I don't have that figure to hand, Presiding Officer, but of course, let me say right from the offset, as First Minister, I don't want a single person having to wait longer than they have to. I apologise, of course, to anybody that is waiting unnecessarily on a waiting list for treatment. And I think most people will recognise, I hope most people will acknowledge the significant impact, of course, that the pandemic has had, the biggest challenge I think our NHS has ever faced in its almost 75-year existence. So we are making some progress in relation to the targets that have been set to reduce waiting times, both in terms of outpatients and inpatients. But I think the Government, and I certainly would be the first to recognise, that of course we have to do more. And that's why the recovery of our NHS is a significant priority, is the priority for this Government, and that's why we're investing a record £19 billion this year in order to help recover the NHS and reduce those waiting lists.
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, the number the First Minister was looking for is 18,390. That's over 18,000 families with a loved one who died waiting for treatment that could have prolonged or in some cases saved their lives. In 2017, 7,868 Scots died while on an NHS waiting list, and immediately before COVID it was 13,211, and if this current trend continues, it will be over 20,000 this year. These aren't just numbers, these are people waiting in pain, many dying far too early, leaving behind heartbroken families. And as Health Secretary, Humza Yousaf failed to get a grip of NHS waiting lists, and on his watch they grew by over 175,000. Nearly 2 years ago, he published a recovery plan for the NHS, and since then things have got worse. So can the First Minister tell us clearly, when will his government meet the legal treatment time guarantee so that fewer Scots are losing their lives?
First Minister.
Can I say to Anna Sarwar, he is, of course, absolutely right to raise the issue of waiting lists and the fact that they have increased throughout the course of the pandemic. I cannot escape and will not escape from that matter of fact. But the pandemic is not just a fleeting matter. It is not a matter that can just be mentioned and then not fully explored in terms of the clear impact it has had. There's no doubt that the pandemic has been the biggest shock that NHS, I think health services in Europe and globally have faced. And that's not unique to Scotland. Of course, I am responsible and we are responsible for the health service here in Scotland, but it's clearly impacted in health services right across the UK. We are making progress in relation to that recovery plan that Anna Sarwar mentions. For example, if I look at the outpatient 2-year waits, we've seen that numbers are down 19% from the last quarter, crucially down almost 70% from quarter 2 in 2022. In terms of 12-month, those that are waiting a year or 12 months in relation to outpatients, we know that since the target was introduced in quarter 3 2022, the numbers of new outpatients has reduced by over 15%. If I look at inpatients, again, we've seen similar decrease. If I look at inpatient day cases, those that have waited over 2 years, we've seen those numbers significantly reduced by 27% since those targets were announced. And we can see a similar pattern in terms of improvement in relation to diagnostics as well. So we are making progress in relation to those targets, and we're also investing record numbers in our NHS recovery and indeed in our social care recovery. But I've always been upfront, whether it was when I was Health Secretary or my current role as First Minister, that the recovery of the NHS will not take weeks or months. It will take years, and that's why we have a 5-year recovery plan that I am absolutely committed in continuing to see progress in, and committed to ensuring it has record investment alongside it.
Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, as Health Secretary, Hamza Yusuf said he would have eradicated two-year waits by now, and he has patently failed. And things were getting worse before COVID, and things have got a lot worse in the 2 years since he published his NHS catch-up plan. And grieving families will see through these excuses. But this isn't even the full picture. According to FOI responses, thousands of people are forced to leave the NHS and pay for their treatment in the middle of a cost-of-living crisis. In one health board alone, the number has quadrupled between 2019 and 2023, and people without insurance paying for private treatment has increased by 73% since before the pandemic. 73%. Our NHS was built on the principle of healthcare free at the point of need, and that is clearly no longer the case for thousands of people in Scotland. So does the First Minister accept that his incompetence has created a two-tier NHS, where people are forced to either go into debt in order to stop the pain and get the treatment they need, or to languish on an NHS waiting list?
First Minister.
No, I don't agree with Anna Sarwar's characterisation. I'll come to why in just a second. It wasn't a list of excuses I read out. I read out a list of facts. I read out some of the data, some of the statistics around some of the progress that has been made. Now, that is not to take away from individuals right across this country who are waiting far too long. We know that, of course, waiting on a waiting list can have significant and severe consequences. That's why, for example, we are investing in our national treatment centres. We have 4 that are opening this year. A couple of them have already opened. I'll be pleased in a couple of weeks' time to officially open NTC Highland. We have NTC Forth Valley in the second phase of NHS Golden Jubilee opening later this year, and that will give us additional capacity. We know that NTC Fife plans include 500 orthopaedic procedures this year, rising to more than 700 by 2025-2026. In the first year of opening, the first of the national treatment centres, the National Eye Centre in NHS Golden Jubilee, that delivered almost 9,000 cataract procedures. So we are investing in that additional capacity. In terms of the use of private healthcare, I don't want anybody to have to feel that the only choice they have to go to is private healthcare. But to go to Anna Sarwar's point, this is not because the SNP is in government. It's unique to Scotland. It is, of course, a situation that is affecting health services right across the entire UK. If I take private healthcare as an example, the rate of people self-funding for private inpatient day case care is 19.9% higher in England than it is here. In Wales, it's over 120% higher than it is here in Scotland. So we know that these issues are affecting people right across the UK, and the reason why, of course, is the pandemic. But we'll continue to not just invest in the NHS, we'll continue to make sure our staff are the best paid in the UK. We'll make sure that we don't lose days on strike. Of course, Scotland, the only part of the UK to ensure not a single day in the NHS was lost to strike over the course of the winter. And we'll continue to make sure we do everything we can to fill those vacancies. But there can be no NHS recovery without a social care recovery. And what hasn't helped social care, of course, is Brexit, where, of course, we've seen many staff leave social care because of that hard Brexit that has been imposed on Scotland. So I'll continue to make sure that we have record amounts invested in the recovery of both our NHS and of social care too.
Question number 3, Ariane Burgess.
To ask the First Minister what priority the Scottish Government gives to protecting Scotland's environment.
First Minister.
Scotland's natural environment is central to our identity as a nation. It's fundamental to our health, to our quality of life, to our economy. And this year we're investing nearly £1 billion in our natural environment. And of course we remain committed to working with our partners in the Green Group on the priorities for net zero and for nature that is set out clearly in the Butte House Agreement. So I and my government are fully committed to protecting and enhancing Scotland's environment. But progress, of course, depends on us being able to use the powers that are fully devolved to this Parliament. Just this week, of course, we've seen the UK Government determined to ride roughshod over a measure to improve recycling, dramatically reduce litter by seeking to sabotage regulations that this Parliament passed on bottle and can recycling. And that, of course, is simply unacceptable.
Ariane Burgess.
Handing on a clean and nature-rich environment to future generations is one of the biggest responsibilities of government. So it is astonishing to hear that the UK government, at a whim, is undermining our Parliament's effort to reduce litter and improve recycling by aiming to sabotage Scotland's deposit return scheme. Given that the Tory UK government was elected on a manifesto commitment to have a scheme which included glass, and given that Labour in Wales has joined Scotland in our shared commitment to a scheme with glass, does the First Minister believe that all members here should listen to the evidence, listen to their own promises and colleagues, and let Scotland get on with the job for which this Parliament voted?
First Minister.
Ariane Burgess is absolutely right to highlight what it can only be described as shameful hypocrisy of the Conservatives on this matter. Whether it's Rishi Sunak, whether it's Alistair Jack, of course, whether it's Douglas Ross, they stood on a manifesto promising a deposit return scheme that included glass. It was Maurice Golden, of course, who told us that if you're going to do it properly and include glass. The Tory government has U-turned on its very own promises, and indeed is going contrary to the evidence of what will help us to tackle this climate emergency, what will help us to increase recycling rates, and what will help us to remove that litter, that glass that can be hazardous to children, to pets, from our streets, from our parks and from our beaches. But it does not stop, of course, at the Tories. Labour in Wales share Scotland's anger about the treatment of devolved parliaments. They share our ambition to have glass included. And there was a time when Labour in Scotland did stand up for the Scottish Parliament's right to make our own choices. I shudder to think what greats like John Smith or Donald Dewar, those architects of devolution, what they would be thinking about at Scottish Labour's complete and utter silence at the fact that the Conservatives, time and time again, want to undermine devolution. So what the latest action from the Conservatives has shown us is that the Tories, they're bad for business in Scotland, they're bad for the environment, they're bad for devolution. No wonder they've never won an election here in the last 50 years, and I suspect if they keep going, they won't win another one for another 50 years, Presiding Officer.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This government has cut the total forestry and land budget by £3.4 million. It has cut the environmental quality budget by £3.9 million. And it has cut Scottish Water's budget by £1.8 million. Isn't this his own shameful hypocrisy, trotting out warm words on protecting Scotland's environment with these cold cuts?
First Minister.
We have, of course, an excellent record when it comes to the forestry, when it comes to, for example, peatland restoration, when it comes to taking action to tackle the climate emergency. And, of course, as I've said already to his leader, the branch officer manager, Douglas Ross, every time we bring forward a proposal, we bring forward a measure to tackle the climate emergency, it's opposed by the Conservatives time and time and time again. If we waited for the Conservatives, if we went at their glacial pace, there won't be a planet for future generations to enjoy. So what we'll continue to do is make sure we don't just talk the talk, but we walk the walk, that we put our money where our mouth is. It would be great if Liam Kerr could use any influence he has. I know he doesn't have much, but if he has any influence with his colleagues in London to make sure they do the right thing by Scotland, by the climate emergency, and for goodness sake, finally give us at least a penny of investment into the Acorn project, into the Scottish cluster that can help us to tackle the climate emergency.
Question number 4, Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reports that the Community Pharmacy Scotland Board has described the financial settlement that it has been offered as derisory.
First Minister.
Community pharmacies are a key point of access to NHS healthcare. They provide the right care in the right place at the right time. And discussions are ongoing with Community Pharmacy Scotland on the financial settlement for 23-24. We will build on the increased funding that we've provided year on year for the last 5 years for community pharmacy services. This has delivered over £25 million in additional remuneration funding. We've also recently added an additional £20 million to the value of the drug tariff this financial year.
to address the increasing cost of medicine. We look forward to a continued engagement with Community Pharmacy Scotland.
Christine Graham.
First, I thank the First Minister for his answer, and I do hope discussions conclude shortly, recognising the key role they play in sustaining the health and well-being of our constituents. And on the line of delivering the right care at the right time and the right place, does the First Minister agree with me that pharmacies such as the High Street pharmacy in Lauder and the larger chain pharmacy Boots and Galashiels, for example, both in my constituency, with their expanding professional services, also ease pressure on GPs and even accident and emergency services, emphasising yet again their key role in our health service?
First Minister.
Christine Graham is absolutely right. They do provide an exceptional service, whether that's in terms of minor ailments, whether that's in relation to the Pharmacy First services that they provide, and all the other range of services that our pharmacists, whether they are small independent pharmacies or whether they're, of course, part of larger chains. What I would say to Christine Graham, to give her some level of reassurance, that we are committed to continuing to fund those vital services. Since its introduction, for example, Pharmacy First has become established as a key part of the remobilisation of the NHS. I'm grateful to all pharmacy contractors, all pharmacy staff, for continuing to support this vital element of primary care in Scotland. It is funded separately, but current annual funding of £30.8 million is allocated for Pharmacy First, including £10 million of new funding, which was invested between 2021 and 22-23. So I agree with Christine Graham about the excellent services that are provided by pharmacies right across the country. And as I mentioned in response to her first question, those discussions and negotiations with Community Pharmacy Scotland are ongoing, and hopeful we'll get hopefully to an agreed position.
Carol Mockin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In his written response to my question, as then Health Secretary, Hamza Yousaf said that the previous financial package ensured continuous expansion in the quality and number of services that can be offered by community pharmacy contractors to local communities. Just this week, following a new offer made by the government he now leads, we're being warned that opening hours may reduce and services could be cut back. How has it gone so badly wrong yet again on his watch, and will he personally be meeting with community pharmacy representatives to resolve this important issue?
First Minister.
Well, of course, the pharmacy sector is not immune to the high energy costs, high inflation costs that are affecting everybody and every single business right up and down the country. And of course, we have called on the UK Government to do more. They have not done enough, of course, to address many of the issues that, of course, were of their making. But what is in our gift is to ensure that we are giving appropriate resource and funding to pharmacy services here in Scotland. And we've increased funding year on year for the last 5 years for community pharmacy services. And indeed, in Scotland, the government spends £52 per person per year on pharmaceutical services, where Carol Mockin's party are in charge. It is not as high as that. In terms of England, if I look at where the Conservatives are in charge, that figure is £46 per person in England. So we'll continue to invest, we'll continue to make sure we adequately fund pharmacies right up and down this country. I'm really grateful for the services that are provided by our pharmacists and pharmacy staff, as I say, the length and breadth of the country, and I am confident, I'm hopeful we will get to an agreed position, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Sandesh Gulhani.
Thank you. This development, as described by the First Minister, is recent. It was actually just yesterday, and it was the community pharmacists that said that the offer was derisory when they rejected it before this money was put in. But I welcome this money following pressure from community pharmacy and myself, because it does ease some of the... Well, I'm glad the SNP are laughing, because they clearly don't care about community pharmacists. It eases some of the cost pressures on the community pharmacy networks whilst the negotiations continue. Will the Scottish Government underwrite the risk that the network is carrying on behalf of the NHS so that they can continue to supply essential medicines and support the people of Scotland with the full service offering?
First Minister.
Can I just remind the Chamber that Dr Sanders Gohani has nothing to do with the negotiations that we're taking forward with Community Pharmacy Scotland. The investment, of course, is coming from the Scottish Government, and of course the Health Secretary and the Minister for Public Health are involved in those discussions with Community Pharmacy Scotland. What I will do is make sure that we continue to fund pharmacies and pharmacists right up and down the country to the level that they require. Of course, they are facing these challenges because of the pressures of inflation, because of high energy costs, because of energy bills. And of course, there are some global factors which are affecting medicine prices as well. And that's why the Scottish Government ensured that we gave additional funding, additional £20 million to the value of the drug tariff in the current financial year. So we'll continue with our engagement, with Community Pharmacy Scotland, and I'm very, very grateful for the excellent services that they provide, as I say, right across the length and breadth of Scotland.
Question number 5, Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is regarding recent reports that suggest there is a mental health crisis emerging in the early years sector.
First Minister.
The unprecedented pressures of the past few years, including Brexit, the COVID pandemic, the cost crisis, they are, of course, taking a toll on a number of people's mental health, including early year staff. I'm particularly grateful to everyone in the workforce for continuing to operate as key workers throughout this difficult time. That's why, since October 2020, the Scottish Government has invested over £2 million in the well-being of the education workforce. We've also worked with Early Years Scotland to develop Team ELC Wellbeing Hub, specifically to support professionals. This builds on what local authorities, as direct employers, are doing to support the well-being of those that they employ.
Megan Gallagher.
Presiding Officer, I have been raising concerns over an emerging childcare crisis since being elected to this Parliament. This SNP government have done nothing to fix the problems in our childcare sector. Now, more than 8,000 nursery and childcare staff have taken sick leave because of stress or mental health concerns. These absences are indicative of a childcare crisis, with more than 9 in 10 councils unable to fully fund free childcare. Nurseries are closing their doors and parents are without childcare for their children. Audit Scotland has even said the sector is fragile. First Minister, early years practitioners are children's first educators. They are being let down by this government. Will he therefore meet with me and nursery providers to discuss the 1,140-hour policy, since he has expressed an interest to expand the provision as part of his leadership bid?
First Minister.
Of course, we do offer the most generous offer of childcare anywhere in the UK. I'm really proud of what we've achieved, that 1140 hours. I do recognise the challenges that are faced by the sector, and that's why Natalie Dawn, the Minister, of course, for Children and Young People, and for the Minister responsible for keeping the promise, met with the PVI sector, I believe just this week, but certainly recently. And of course, I'll ensure that the Government continues to engage, be it with Megan Gallagher or indeed with the sector directly. And I do take this issue of mental health very, very seriously indeed. That's why, as I say, we have invested over £2 million in the well-being of the education workforce, and working with local authorities in relation to what more can be done, particularly for ELC staff. What we're also making sure that we are doing to help with these challenges, be it the mental health challenges, be it the workload pressures, be it, of course, the cost crisis that her party have created, is making sure that we pay staff, making sure that staff are well paid, those that work, of course, in early learning and childcare. So before the expansion of early learning childcare began, approximately 80% of staff delivering funded ELC were paid less than the living wage. In contrast, our 2021 health check indicated that 88% of private providers intended to pay the real living wage to the staff from August 2021. So we'll continue our focus on making sure that we expand childcare. We know the benefits that it can have for parents, for families, particularly the positive disproportionate impact it can have on women entering into the workforce. So we'll continue our focus on that, and we'll continue to engage, be it with Megan Gallagher, but more importantly with the PVI sector too.
Claire Haughey.
Thank you, President Officer. Recent research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found that a quarter of adults in Scotland have accessed the NHS due to the impact of the cost of living crisis on their mental or physical health. Can the First Minister outline what progress can be made through existing powers to protect workers, including those in our childcare sector, from being further impacted by this crisis?
First Minister.
Well, Claire Hawke is absolutely right, of course, to raise these issues, and we'll do everything we can in our gift to use the powers of devolution to their absolute maximum to help particularly those that are the most vulnerable, particularly helping those in the lowest income households. And that's why I was really pleased this week to visit Castlebrae Community Campus and meet with not just young people, but also parents and families that have been impacted and helped by the Scottish Child Payment. 303,000 children now in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment, a game-changing intervention from this government. On top of that, of course, many other benefits that are only available in Scotland now being awarded through Social Security Scotland. So we'll do everything we can in our gift to try to help with the cost of living crisis, which clearly has a mental health impact on many people across the country. The unfortunate problem, of course, is that for all the good that we can do, the UK government, with their over a decade of austerity, with their cost of living crisis, with the mini budget that wrecked the economy, we are having to spend not millions, presiding officer, but billions of pounds trying to mitigate the worst effects of Conservative austerity. If Scotland has to continue to do that, that means less and less money spent on education, on health, on transport and justice. And that, to me, presiding officer, is simply not acceptable.
Question number 6, Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Minister First Minister if any objections or concerns are raised by Scottish ministers about the guidelines for sentencing under 25s in Scotland, which came into effect in January 2022.
First Minister.
In line with the requirements agreed by this Parliament, the content of sentencing guidelines is, of course, entirely a matter for the independent judge-led Scottish Sentencing Council. As part of the consultation the Council undertakes on guidelines, Scottish ministers were cited on a near final draft of the guideline. I replied at the time as Cabinet Secretary for Justice, noting that the Council had taken an evidence-led collaborative approach in developing the draft guideline, promoting rehabilitation, early intervention and alternatives to custody, and ultimately working to reduce reoffending. I'm pleased that reoffending levels have fallen over the last decade, and this is helping to keep our communities safe. It should be noted that the position in the guideline is that custody is, of course, still an option for sentencing young people, and is, of course, completely right that this option remains available to the court in any given case. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, Angela Constant, met very recently with Lady Doreen to discuss how the Council plans to keep these guidelines under review.
Holly McNeill.
We know that there have been at least 2 reported cases where there is public concern about the leniency of sentencing. Firstly, in the case where there was no jail sentence for the rape of a 13-year-old girl, but secondly, on the horrific rape and murder of Joe Barclay, where there was a reduction in sentence of 4 years. So the First Minister has confirmed today that he sees no role for the Parliament, but only for the Sentencing Council. It seems that it's nothing to do with this Parliament as far as the First Minister is concerned. Now, I wonder if it's a very significant change in sentencing policy. Now, is the First Minister aware that this Parliament did have a say when it came to the discounting of sentencing in relation to early pleas? So I don't understand why at least Parliament wouldn't have a say in this. When it comes to horrific crimes as serious as rape and murder, does the First Minister believe that there should be a reduced sentence for under 25s? But at least could he at least give Parliament some comfort that he believes that this Parliament should have some oversight on significant changes to sentencing policy in Scotland?
First Minister.
What I would say to Pauline McNeill, who I know has a long-standing interest in these matters, is that, of course, there was a public consultation when it came to the guideline. Now, I don't know whether Pauline McNeill or the Scottish Labour Party responded to that public consultation, but every single guideline does go through that public consultation process, quite a lengthy process before that guideline is eventually approved by the High Court. And of course, as I said, from a Scottish Government perspective, we did respond to the guideline at the time. What I also say to Polly McNeill, and I'm happy to send her more details, she may have seen this already, of course, when it comes to this particular guideline, there is a mountain of evidence, about 122 pages of Edinburgh University research, which helped to inform that sentencing guideline when it came to the issues of cognitive maturity within the justice system, and particularly amongst young people. So for me, it's absolutely right that the decisions on sentencing are for the independent judiciary. Now, where the Parliament has an interest, of course, it is fine for Polly McNeill to bring forward a member's bill. If she thinks the government should be bringing forward legislation on a matter, I'm more than happy to consider that. But it must be the case, it must always be the case, even in those cases where there are particularly heinous crimes, that sentencing is always a matter for the independent judiciary and should be free from any political interference whatsoever.
We'll move to general and constituency supplementaries, and questions and responses should be brief, and I call Alistair Allen.
Last night, CalMac announced it would yet again be abandoning ferry services from South Uist for virtually all of June to make up for issues elsewhere. In a statement that could only have been written a long way from South Uist, customers were advised that they could get to Oban and Mallaig via either Marra or Skye instead. What more can the Scottish Government do to challenge CalMac's decision, given that this community has already seen a third of its services cancelled during the last year?
First Minister.
I can thank Alistair Allen for raising what was an incredibly important issue for his constituents. I know many members will have an interest in this issue as well. Can I say, first and foremost, I will ensure that the Transport Minister reflects the point about comms, because we know this is an issue again that has been raised time and time again by our island communities, who, of course, are feeling anger and frustration in relation to the latest developments and want to hear better communication when there is, unfortunately, disruption to the ferry services. I do recognise the significant impact that this particular disruption will have in the communities in use. I know the Minister for Transport has made very clear to CalMac that they must continue to explore every single avenue possible to keep this disruption to an absolute minimum. The Minister not only visited North and South Uist last week, he met with South Uist Business Impact Group earlier this morning. I haven't had a readout from that meeting, but I will make sure I do shortly after First Minister's questions. And I will, as Alistair Allen has asked me to do, ensure that CalMac are exploring every single avenue possible to minimise this disruption as much as they possibly can.
Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I raise the plight of a vulnerable and deteriorating individual with severe learning difficulties who is in the care of Dumfries and Galloway Council, but for complex reasons has ended up trapped in a residential home in the south of England. For over a year, her sister has been desperately trying to get her back home closer to family. At every turn, social work have deliberately obstructed this and seem to be willing the lady to die or become too weak to travel in order to save themselves cost and hassle. Despite notice being served by the existing home and a best interest meeting agreeing with the family that she should return to Scotland, progress has been extremely limited. If I provide her details privately, will the First Minister step in and ensure her human dignity is respected?
First Minister.
Of course, I'm happy to look at the details of the case, and of course the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care will also look at the details of the case. If there is some way that we can assist, then we will do that. But of course I would say to Oliver Mundell, and I'm sure he does understand this, that it is really important that we do not overstep in terms of professional decision making or indeed clinical decision making that may well be a factor in this particular case. But I hear what Oliver Mundell has to say. He makes a very powerful contribution on behalf of his constituents. I can't imagine what their family are going through, and therefore, of course, I will look at the detail if Oliver Mundell sends that to me shortly after First Minister's questions.
Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. New forecasts from the Scottish Fiscal Commission show a concerning gap between eligibility and uptake of the Scottish Child Payment, projecting that over 60,000 families could miss out. This disparity is most pronounced among children between 6 and 15, with only 80% of that age cohort estimated to take the payment up, compared with 92% for under 6s. The child payment was unanimously supported across this Parliament, but, Presiding Officer, the payment only has the ability to change lives if people are aware they are entitled and, crucially, are supported to apply for it. Therefore, I would ask the First Minister, if he is serious, as he says, about tackling poverty, will he investigate and address this concerning disparity between eligibility and uptake of the child payment to ensure that it has the fullest impact that we all support?
First Minister.
I'm given an assurance that this is a key area of focus for the Government. The Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice and I have had a conversation already, and there's already good work being undertaken in relation to marketing, awareness, to make sure that we do everything we possibly can so that every single person that is eligible for that game-changing intervention does take it up. As I mentioned already, I was in Castlebrae High School only this week, talking to school children, talking to parents who have benefited from that positive intervention. We've made excellent progress in the extension of the Scottish Child Payment to under 16s. Statistics, as I have already said, show that 303,000 children were in receipt by the end of March. But I can give Paul O'Kane an absolute assurance we are working hard to do what we can to continue to raise awareness so that everybody who is eligible can take up that game-changing Scottish Child Payment.
Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following FMQs today, I'll be holding a members' debate on encouraging women and girls into STEM. So given the importance of STEM, in particular to the North East economy and its role in Scotland's transition to net zero, can I ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to motivate women and girls to pursue careers in STEM?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Audrey Nicholl for the excellent work that she is doing, and my apologies that I can't make the event later on. We know, of course, that the more effort we put in relation to STEM and ensuring that we get more women and girls into STEM subjects is beneficial, not just for them, but of course for the economy going forward in Scotland. So there's a range of interventions that we are taking forward. I'm happy to write to Audrey Nicholl with the detail of all the interventions that we are taking forward in relation to this particular issue. But it is an absolute win-win. The more we invest in encouraging women, encouraging girls into STEM subjects, the better it is for the economy as a whole, and everybody benefits as a result of it.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister knows that many experienced staff are departing the private and voluntary nursery sector because those nurseries receive lower fees than those in the councils, because during the leadership contest he promised to close that gap. Is he going to commit to delivering that, as he said, in the next budget for 23-24? Is he going to keep the promise?
First Minister.
Willie Rennie is right. I did promise to, of course, look at the issue and understand very clearly the concerns that are raised, particularly by the PVI sector. And he'll have heard from a previous response that the Minister, Natalie Dawn, met with the sector just recently. Willie Rennie may also be aware that despite having the highest rates in the UK in 22-23, both the Scottish Government and local government recognise the need to strengthen the process of rate setting, and we're working with COSLA to take forward an evidence-based sustainable rates review, and that will be reporting soon. So I am absolutely determined, absolutely focused to ensure that we're supporting the PVI sector, who are so crucial in helping us to expand that exceptional offer of free childcare right across the country.
That concludes First Minister's questions. Point of order, Liam Kerr.
I'm very grateful. When failing to answer Douglas Ross earlier, the First Minister said the UK Government has given, quote, not a single penny of funding towards the Scottish Cluster or the Acorn project. Now, anyone in command of his brief would know that the UK Government has in fact given over £40 million to the Scottish Cluster. And, Presiding Officer, in light of John Swinney voluntarily correcting the record following his misleading the Chamber last night, would the Presiding Officer advise the First Minister on how he might correct his latest gaffe?
The members will be aware that the Chair is not responsible for the content of members' contributions. Of course, we would always expect that the contents of responses address specific questions put, and that where members become aware of any inaccuracy, they take the measures that are available to them in order to make any corrections. Thank you. There will be a brief suspension before we move on to members' business. Thank you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.